Thanks for coming to this press conference. The number of new local COVID-19 cases has stabilized and remained low. This is the result of the hard work that everyone has put in over these past few months. I want to thank everyone for your efforts and for your perseverance and resilience. With the situation roughly under control, the task force will continue to resume more activities carefully in our journey of safe opening towards Phase 3. Public health and safety will remain our top priority even as we progress towards Phase 3. And together, we must do our best to keep Singaporeans safe. At the individual level, let us all continue to play our part by keeping up our vigilance. I know many Singaporeans are looking forward to Phase 3, but I want to remind everyone that Phase 3 is not a return to normal during the pre-COVID days. It will entail living, working, and interacting with safe management and safe distancing measures in place. But the silver lining is that over these few months, we have incorporated many of these good habits in our daily routine and have adapted our social norms and behavior. The key now is not to let our guard down and let our painstaking efforts the last few months go to waste. By now, we know that these measures that we have put in place are effective in reducing the risk of transmission of the virus. We will maintain the key measures, but we will see where we can make adjustments to allow further resumption of activities. We know that interaction in large groups carry inherent risks and could easily result in a super spreading event and large clusters. We will therefore continue to set limits on group sizes, both in public spaces as well as visitors to homes. But in Phase 3, we could increase the group size for gatherings outside the home from the present 5 persons to 8 persons. The number of visitors allowed to visit homes could also similarly be increased to 8. This would allow families with more than 5 persons to be able to get together and enjoy some face-to-face time that no amount of virtual interaction can replace. But safe distancing remains a key measure in reducing the risk of spread. We will continue to set requirements on safe distancing as well as to disallow or minimize interactions between groups. Presently, public venues like museums and attractions are already open, subject to a capacity limit. Events like congregational worship services and wedding receptions can also be held in 2 zones of 5 persons each. In Phase 3, these capacity limits could be increased, and we could allow events with multiple zones of 50 persons each, subject to limitations on the capacity of the venue. Masks should continue to be worn outside of the home, and personal hygiene practices adhered to. This is now even more important as we allow more activities to resume. Timely testing is a crucial prerequisite for early identification, isolation, diagnosis, and treatment of cases, and is therefore a critical enabler and key strategy in our fight against COVID-19. In addition to the various community groups we are testing, the Multi-Ministry Task Force is piloting the use of pre-event COVID-19 testing for large-scale and high-risk activities. To prevent transmission at these events, only participants who test negative for COVID-19 will be allowed to participate in these events. To do this, we need tests that provide rapid results. The PCR test is still the gold standard that yields highly accurate results, but it takes time, and the tests may need to be taken 1 or 2 days in advance. We are exploring the use of antigen rapid tests for pre-event testing, which can return fairly accurate results quickly and can be administered just before the event. Some of the events we'll be piloting will include, for example, business-to-business events and wedding receptions. This does not mean that we can throw caution to the wind and ignore safe management measures at these events. In fact, despite the tests, there is always a possibility that an infected person may not be detected. So even if the test results are negative, safe management measures will still have to be strictly adhered to at these events. Alongside safe management measures and scaled-up testing, we need to continue to strengthen our contact tracing regime by leveraging on our safe entry and TraceTogether. For every step we take towards allowing more activities, we must have countermeasures in place to keep the risk of transmission low. This means that as we allow more activities to resume, adherence to the safe management and safe distancing measures becomes even more critical. Let us all play our part to keep ourselves, our loved ones, and our fellow Singaporeans safe. And if we can continue to keep community cases low, we can continue to open up our borders safely and resume more activities and progress towards Phase 3. Phase 3 will stay until the virus is well under control, not only in Singapore, but also around the world. It will therefore be a long haul. But I am confident that we can overcome these challenges together and adapt nimbly when the situation calls for it. Together, we can emerge stronger than before. I will now ask my DMS, Professor Kenneth Mak, to give a quick update on our medical situation.
Thank you very much, Minister. As of today, the 20th of October, 2020, the Ministry of Health has preliminarily confirmed 2 new cases of locally transmitted COVID-19 infection. Based on our investigation so far, both of these cases reside in the dormitories, and there are no new cases in the community. In addition, we have 4 imported cases to report, all of whom had been placed on the stay-home notice when they arrived in Singapore. So in total, there are 6 new cases of COVID-19 infection in Singapore today. The rest of the details will be provided through an update via the MOH press release that will be issued later today.
Good evening. We've shared with you the roadmap towards Phase 3, and the key to remember is that any relaxation has to come with additional controls and safeguards. In some ways, you can liken the current situation to one where a fire has just been put out, but there are still embers of the fire lying around. Each time we make further relaxation of any measures, we are simply adding wood to the fire. And you don't know when, but at some point in time, the more wood you add, the whole thing will combust yet again into a giant fire. So the key to prevent that from happening is to combine relaxation of measures with additional safeguards, namely scaled up tracing, testing, and continued adherence to safe management measures. As you heard just now, in terms of tracing, we would like to see many more people get on board the TraceTogether program and a larger scale deployment of what we call TraceTogether only safe entry, or TT only safe entry, where we integrate TraceTogether with safe entry. So that has to happen first. Second, we will be ramping up testing, including through the use of rapid antigen test kits, as you heard just now as well. And then thirdly, even with more testing, with better capability to trace, there must still be continued adherence to some of the key safe distancing and safe management measures. If we do all of that, then we will be able to proceed with further relaxation in Phase 3 along the lines that has been described, meaning group sizes can go up from 5 to 8. Events can have more than multiple groups of 50 people coming together. And we can also continue with our opening up of our borders and travel arrangements with other countries. When can all of these measures take place? That is the big question, and the answer is that it really depends on all of us. Because if we work together, cooperate, and comply with the requirements and the measures, then we can keep community transmission rates low, and there is a chance that we can enter phase 3 before the end of the year. On the other hand, if we let our guard down and new clusters emerge, then this timeline will have to be pushed back, and we do not know when we can resume going into phase 3. It may have to be pushed back for a long time or even indefinitely, depending on the situation. So we really need everyone to continue to stay vigilant and cooperate with all the measures that are in place so that collectively we can continue to make good progress in our journey towards safe reopening and resumption of more activities. I would like to also highlight one particular sector where which we have identified as a sector with a higher risk setting. And this is the nightlife industry, which comprises bars, clubs, karaoke lounges, as well as nightclubs. And we know these are higher risk settings. The nature of the activities themselves, of such activities, means that you have people socializing in close contact, often in a small enclosed space, and the risk is very much higher. We've seen it in many other countries where large clusters break out in these sorts of settings. So even at the start of phase 3, when we enter phase 3, we do not expect to reopen these or resume these activities anytime soon. We are prepared to consider pilots in some of these settings with much more stringent safe management measures in place. So we will discuss with the nightlife industry how some of these pilots can take place and what are some of the more stringent conditions. But the basic point is that we do not expect the nightlife industry to be able to reopen or to be able to go back to what it used to be anytime soon, which means that the industry has to be prepared for quite a long period of restrictions being in place. So the government will put in place also assistance measures to help the industry during this period. And in particular, the assistance measures will enable business operators and owners to exit, transit, and pivot to new areas. So details of that assistance package will be highlighted and announced separately. All in all, we've been at this for, I think, almost 9 months now. I know it's been a long, it seems like a lifetime to some of us. And many people are feeling tired and fatigued. But I think we also need to understand the fight is far from over. The situation may look stable now because of all of us working together and helping to keep the infection under control. But the situation around the world is far from over. You look at countries everywhere, many of them are experiencing a major flare-up of the virus. And the case counts continues to rise globally. The hope for a vaccine is there. There are promising candidates, but the journey towards distributing a safe and effective vaccine to billions of people around the world will take a long time. So we really have to gird ourselves for a long fight, and we should take that perspective in looking at this issue. This is not something we can overcome within 1 or 2 months. We really have to be prepared for the long haul and continue with our vigilant, disciplined approach in maintaining all the necessary measures and allowing us to progressively reopen and resume activities safely. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I open the floor for questions from the floor, I'd like to just make a quick correction. I might have said that currently we allow 2 zones of 5 for congressional service and wedding receptions. Actually, it's 2 zones of 50. And in phase 3, we could consider multiple zones of 50 each. Just a factual correction. Now, welcome questions from the journalists.
Thank you, panelists. We will now begin with the Q&A segment. Media agencies, please remember to use the raise hand function on Zoom if you would like to ask a question, and please be reminded to keep to one question only. We'll have the first question from Cheryl from Channel News Asia.
Good afternoon, ministers and DMS. I would actually like to ask about, given the rising number of cases in Malaysia, about 800 cases a day in the past few days, what is the threshold for us to reconsider our current travel arrangements in allowing them to come in with them?
We continue to monitor the situation, and the monitoring is not just based on the reported case numbers in Malaysia, because we also look at the travelers coming from Malaysia to Singapore. There are already safeguards in place for such travelers, including testing them when they are in Singapore. So based on these tests, we will have actual data of what sort of prevalence rate the Malaysian travelers have when they are in Singapore, and they will be reflected in our imported cases. So, as I said, we monitor this very closely, whether it's Malaysia or any other country, and based on this experience, based on the actual data, based on the observations of prevalence from the travelers who come into Singapore, we will adjust our measures accordingly. But the assurance to everyone is that our travel arrangements are not a free-for-all sort of travel arrangements. People do come in, but there is a system of stay-home notice as well as testing in place to ensure that they are safe before they can come into the community.
Thank you, Minister. We'll have the next question from Sun Kiat from Zao Bao.
Good evening, ministers and DMS. I have one question, which is about, are we looking at rolling out the Antigen rapid tests for incoming travelers into Singapore to resume more leisure travel in the future?
At this moment, we are still using PCR tests for travel. So again, we are monitoring and considering all the different options. We are not close to considering options other than PCR tests, but the key is to ensure that whatever test we put in place is able to ensure that we pick up the cases sensitively, and we assure ourselves that even as we open up our borders, we will be able to minimize the risk of imported cases. So this is still work in progress. There are a few options that we are considering, but for the moment, we are still using the PCR test.
I think we should also bear in mind that the type of test that we employ will also depends on the purpose of the test and the nature of the person that we are testing on. For travelers, for example, we also will differentiate between those traveling from countries, places with higher prevalence, or those who are traveling from countries, places with lower prevalence. We may take a differentiated approach in time to come. But suffice to say that we are currently still testing, validating the antigen tests, and we are applying them in certain circumstances, which I mentioned earlier, in terms of a pre-event testing where you need a large number of people may be involved, and you need a very rapid, very quick results, and in order for us to decide whether or not we allow the person to enter into the event. So I think there are specific use cases for different tests, and we are trying them out in different scenarios and see whether they are effective and useful for us. And we don't rule out the possibility of deploying any of these tests for travelers, but it also depends on whether the outcome of the trials that we are conducting now.
So, very quick addition. We shouldn't think of it in binary terms, PCR or antigen test and either or, because it can be a combination of both. We have also said, for example, that for travelers from higher risk countries today coming into Singapore, they have to serve a 14-day self-isolation period in a dedicated facility. This is the main deterrence to travel today, right? And we have been looking at ways in which we can allow for people to come in without having to serve this 14-day self-isolation period. But in return, to ensure that they are safe, we deploy more frequent testing. So an example of such a use case may be, a PCR test when you arrive first, maybe, but later on, the more frequent testing could be done through an antigen test. So there are these different combinations which we are continuing to explore depending on the settings and the use cases.
Thank you, Ministers. May we have the next question from Timothy from the Straits Times?
Thank you, Ministers and DMS. Now, as you mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people here are feeling very fatigued, and what might help is perhaps a clearer goal of what they have to aim for, what they need to do before phase 3 starts. For instance, 2 weeks of no community cases. Is there something specific the task force is waiting for before moving us towards phase 3? And can we get a more specific timeline than just before the end of the year? Thank you.
I tried to explain what we were looking for just now. So just to reiterate, we want more people to come on board the TraceTogether program. Today, I think about 2.5 million people are on board the program, about 45% of the population. We would like that to be higher, 70% or more, so that TraceTogether can be more effective. And we are distributing tokens around through the community centers. I think nearly 50 centers today are already distributing the tokens, and by the end of November, every CC will be able to distribute tokens, and you can pick it up from any CC. Of course, if you don't want the token, you can already download the TraceTogether app on your phone, so it's up to you. But we need that percentage to be higher. We also want to deploy more TT-only safe entry checks. Today, safe entry is quite pervasive, but not the TT-only safe entry, where the safe entry is done through either the TraceTogether app or the TraceTogether token. So we are going to ramp up the deployment of TT-only safe entry across more public venues. We started with cinemas. We will do restaurants, shopping malls, all of these sort of popular venues. We aim to have them as TT-only safe entry. So when we do both a higher take-up rate of TraceTogether and a wider deployment of TT-only safe entry, I think those conditions will help in allowing us to enter phase 3. And as I said, if we have these two conditions and if community transmission throughout this period remains low, then there is a good chance for us entering phase 3, meaning to say raising the group size from 5 to 8 and allowing multiple zones of 50 people to come together for an event before the end of the year.
I should clarify that we mentioned a few measures, things like group size, gatherings, events, some of these parameters that we will be adjusted as we move towards phase 3. I should clarify that we are not likely to do all these measures all at one go. So some of these measures may be implemented progressively. We may adjust the group size first, or we may adjust to permit the larger scale activities first. It depends on the situation, and depends also on the various pilots that we are carrying out at the moment. When they are successful, we may roll out earlier, and as we progress towards phase 3, then some of these measures will then be implemented progressively. So don't expect a big bang, and someday we will announce that all these measures will be implemented all at one go, and voila, we are at phase 3. It's not likely to happen that way. We are going to implement these measures progressively as situation allows and as our pilot turns out positive and we are more confident that we will open it. It also depends a lot on what's happening around the world, and bearing in mind that there are still a lot of emerging cases among our neighboring countries, neighboring regions. Therefore, we have to watch what's happening. As you are aware, that we are also at the same time opening up our borders to ensure that Singapore continues to be connected to the rest of the world, and that, of course, will also increase the risk of imported cases. And therefore, it is important for us to ensure that the safe distancing measures locally in Singapore remains tight. It's also important to bear in mind that phase 3 is not a declaration of victory, that we have now succeeded in overcoming COVID-19 and all of us should go around celebrating and forget about all the safe distancing measures. Actually, phase 3 is a point, is a milestone that we are saying that we have now put in place reasonable safe distancing measures, safeguards that have been put in place to protect ourselves, and we should continue to maintain these safeguards, and we have reached a certain steady state, and we must resume our activities as much as we can while observing safe distancing and safe management measures. So I think it's a situation where we want to continue to be vigilant, to be careful, and to ensure that all the measures we have put in place are well practiced on the ground, all internalized among our Singaporeans, and that will allow us to then continue to open up our economy and our community. And that is where we will arrive at the phase 3.
Thank you, Ministers. Can we have the next question from Stefania from the Financial Times?
Hi, good afternoon. I wanted to ask a little bit about TraceTogether. So if essentially you do not see in the next sort of weeks or months that the adoption of TraceTogether rises to 70% or more, at that point, will you decide to make it mandatory, for example? And if that is something you're considering, at what point would you take that decision? Or if that is not something that you're considering, perhaps could another sort of possibility that you're working towards, would that be not making TraceTogether mandatory, but effectively requiring it to enter all or most venues?
Well, I mentioned just now that we will be ramping up the deployment of TraceTogether only safe entry over the coming weeks and months, or even, because the once we are able to put out the TraceTogether tokens by the end of November, really everyone should either have the chance to get access to a token or the TraceTogether app on the smartphones. So by that time, we do expect to scale up the deployment of TraceTogether only safe entry across many public venues. So with that in place, we do expect majority of people in Singapore to be on board the TraceTogether program, because they will need to be in the program either through the phones or through the token in order to access these venues.
Thank you, Minister. Can we have the next question from Cassandra from Yahoo?
Hi, good evening. You mentioned that there will be much more stringent safe management measures for the nightlife industry. Are you able to give some examples on what sort of measures would be implemented when these businesses open? And also, what's the status of the workers in the dorms? Are their movements still restricted?
For the nightlife industry, I mentioned that we are prepared to consider some pilots, whether it's for bars, pubs, karaoke lounges, or nightclubs. The additional measures that will be put in place would include, and they are not limited, but would include things like having testing of customers before they enter the premise, using a rapid test kit. They would include making sure that all the prevailing safe management measures that we already have in place today are also implemented within the premise itself, which means that people cannot intermingle. They have to have physical distance apart. Music cannot be loud. There is already a prevailing music level for F&B that will have to be exercised. Similarly, in the nightlife sector. And then we would also want to find ways to ensure that these safe distancing and safe management measures are fully complied with. So we might have to use, whether it's CCTV or some way to ensure effective compliance with the measures at all times. So those are some of the ideas we have, but we are still in discussion, or we will be discussing this with the nightlife industry. And like I said, we are not doing this for everyone. We are starting with a few pilots. That's the intent. Based on the pilots, we will consider whether it is safe to proceed. And it's also for the industry itself to consider whether it's viable to proceed. Because with all these measures in place, a dance club may not sound like a dance club anymore. If there is safe management and safe distancing measures, for you to be separated from another person. So we'll have to have this conversation with the industry to consider what's the best way to proceed. And as I said, we do not expect, even with the pilots, for the industry to be able to resume activities like the way it used to be, and this will be for quite some time. And that's why the government is rolling out an assistance package to help business operators and business owners consider whether or not they want to take up the package, transit out, and pivot to another area. For the migrant workers in the dormitories, we are monitoring this very closely because we are still continuing to subject them to the routine testing. From time to time, we still pick up some cases, but as you can tell from the daily reported numbers, the case count has come down, and this is as we had expected, which is that with more regular rounds of routine testing, we do expect the number of cases to come down because we'll be picking up more and more of the cases that are perhaps the hidden cases within the community, within the migrant workers. We are picking them up, and we do expect the number of cases to come down. And so progressively, we will also lift some of the restrictions that are in place as we, once we are confident that the infection is under control and the case count has come down to a point where it is safe for many of these other activities to resume. So this is work in progress, and we are continuing to monitor the situation carefully.
Thank you, Minister. Can we get the next question from Howie from Shinmin Daily News?
Hi, ministers. Recently there's a petition on hoping that our local homegrown Tioheng KTV to open. And so, there have been points taken up that, some people raised that why we can allow maybe 2,000 people to go on cruise, but we cannot allow 5 people to sing in the private KTV room. So given that it will say that it will take quite a while before it can reopen, does that mean that we may potentially not have a nightlife industry anymore in Singapore? And also, why why?
Well, again, it's the nature of the activity, all right? The nature of the activity is quite different, and the ability to make sure that all the safe distancing measures are indeed fully in full compliance with what we have set out, which is that people have to avoid intermingling. They have to ensure that there is safe distancing between groups, whether it's a group size of 5 or later on 8, that safe distancing must be fully complied with, no intermingling, and the nature of the activity itself, whether it's singing, dancing, if in a room with loud music where you're projecting your voice loudly, these are all activities which are known to be of higher risk and are more likely to be super spreader events. It is not just from our own experience, it is from the experience in many other jurisdictions. So given the nature of the activities, as I said, we are putting out what we think are, safe, additional safety requirements in order for these activities to be able to proceed safely. We will be discussing these requirements with the industry to see if they would like to consider pilots where these requirements are in place, and then they can consider operating under these conditions. And if they find it viable, and if they are also able to enforce and comply with the measures, indeed, the activities can resume. On the other hand, if the businesses find it very difficult to sustain, because this is really a very different activity, right? When you think about it, with all the requirements, it's quite a different activity from what one would perceive nightlife to be. And if the businesses find it difficult to proceed, or if they find it difficult to enforce the measures, then we may all conclude together that indeed it is very hard to have such activities under safe conditions, and the businesses themselves may find that they would prefer to transit out, and as I said, the government will provide an assistance package to help them to do so.
Thank you, Minister. Can we get the next question from Polling from Channel 8 News?
Hi, Minister. I would like to check on the multiple zones of 50 persons for events. Is there a number that we are looking at, like how many zones in particular? Like, is there a cap on the total number of individuals?
In a way, we are still exploring the various possibilities, but you have to bear in mind that many of these events will still be subject to the capacity of the venue. If the venue can only accommodate 100, then maximum you can have is 2 zones of 5 each, 50 each. I keep saying 5 each, 50 each. And if the venue is larger and you are able to continue implement safe distancing within the venue, then we may allow more zones of 50 each. So it will depend on, to a large extent, the size of the venues. If it's a theatre, of course, the theatre has a certain capacity, and with the safe distancing measures in place, it will not be able to have a full capacity to accommodate all the patrons. So therefore, I think to a large extent, it will be determined by the capacity of the venue, but it will be organized into zones of 50 each, so that we segregate them to prevent cross-infection between the different zones.
Sorry, Minister. So just to clarify, so there is no limit on the total number, like, I don't know, 1,000 is also feasible if the capacity.
That's right. In principle, the idea is that when we expand it, we may expand it to just based on the capacity of the venue. It also depends on whether the organizer is capable of handling such a large number. Say, for example, if you are looking at seminars, workshops, sometimes you may have 1,000 participants, then you organize them into zones of 50, and then that will be a significant number of zones. And if you are looking at maybe a cinema, or as I mentioned, theaters, you won't be able to accommodate thousands of people. You may then be limited to a few hundreds and organize into, again, zones of 50 each.
Also, just a very quick addition to this, that I think the number of people at any point in time is just one parameter. We really have to look at it setting by setting and the kind of activity that they are engaged in, which is why just now the earlier question talking about cruise and highlighting the numbers of people on a cruise. But it's very different because the people on a cruise ship are not engaging in karaoke singing. They are not engaging, they are not, socializing in a dance club setting. There are different activities, and we ensure very tightly that the kinds of activities they do on a cruise ship comply with all the safe management measures we have put in place. So likewise, if you have a large number of people, but if they are gathered, seated down, and they are not engaged in higher risk activities, then it's a very different sort of risk profile from having many people coming together into a ballroom without their mask on, and then eating, dining, speaking loudly, singing, socializing, I think the risk profile is very different. And that's why we also say that we may consider more numbers for wedding receptions, but given the nature of the activity being of a higher risk, even if we were to allow greater numbers later on, we will consider having the guests in the wedding reception be subject to a pre-event test, right? So if the nature of the activity is of higher risk, then it's not just about numbers, but we may have to either think about additional safeguards and measures, whether it's through pre-event testing or whether it's through stricter safe management measures. But these have to come together.
Thank you, Ministers. The next question will be from Niveda from NHK.
Hi, good evening, Ministers and DMS. I'd like to ask about the TraceTogether only safe entry. Could you give us a timeline for, when it's going to start? When can you expect it to start and where? Thank you.
We will do it progressively over the month of November. In fact, we've started. We announced cinemas not just recently, and then we will progressively roll out to more venues. As I said, that timeline will complement or will be done in conjunction with the timeline for distribution of TraceTogether tokens, because we want to make sure that as we roll out TraceTogether only safe entry, that people have access either to a token or to the TraceTogether app on their phones. So the rollout of TraceTogether tokens will be done by end November, right? Because we would have distributed it to all the CCs in Singapore, all the community clubs in Singapore by the end of November. And so the rollout of TraceTogether only safe entry will be done in conjunction with this distribution timeline.
Thank you, Minister. We'll have the next question from Yevgeny from Itatas.
Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to ask about the situation around vaccine. When it can be available in Singapore. For example, Indonesian government already announced that vaccine could be there already next month. And who will be able to get vaccine first? How much it will cost? Thank you.
I'll ask the DMS to give an update on the status of the vaccines.
Thank you very much, Minister. We are looking to procure several different vaccines, but we are tracking very closely the studies that are taking place, the phase 3 studies for various vaccine candidates, and we're awaiting the results with regard to both efficacy as well as the side effect profile. We have convened also an expert panel of doctors and scientists to advise us with regard to which of the vaccine candidates would be the most suitable for our setting. We're looking not just at trying to get one or two, but we may procure a range of different vaccines. Some of the vaccines will be perhaps more suitable for different types of groups. We understand that some of the phase 3 studies have started to be extended that allows for testing of older people and of various different types, so that we have more confidence that when it comes to vaccinating our vulnerable population, these candidates, vaccine candidates, do have the efficacy and are safe for these people. Based on the arrangements we're making for procurement, we may see vaccines starting to come into Singapore as early as towards the end of this year, but more realistically, I think many of the vaccine candidates will only complete the phase 3 studies sometime next year, and these results then will be carefully studied, and the vaccines then would undergo a registration process before we can bring them into Singapore. So it would be more likely that we would be making plans to vaccinate different parts of our population from next year onwards rather than sometime this year. We are working through who should be offered vaccination when these vaccines come into Singapore. And while we are still finalizing these arrangements, we are looking at the possibility of vaccinating the more vulnerable parts of our population, but also those who are more at risk of getting these infections as a result of the work they do, being in the front line, and perhaps their exposure will be much higher. This could include healthcare professionals and other frontline people in frontline roles as well. But the actual prioritization in terms of who would be vaccinated will need to be further finalized after the discussions of the expert panel and their recommendations to us. So that's the current situation as it is.
Thank you, DMS. We'll have the next question from Daryl from Today.
Good evening, ministers and DMS. Just like to ask, how did the task force arrive at the 8 persons for the group size limit under phase 3?
Thanks. I would have liked to stay at 5, but of course I think 5 is quite stressful for quite a lot of people, and especially families with a large number of members. So we think that if we continue to be quite vigilant in our safe distancing measures, and we are quite mindful and quite serious in protecting ourselves, I think we can afford to increase the number as we progress towards phase 3. And we have thought about whether we should move to 10 instead of just 8. But we also have to bear in mind that even within the public places, whether it's restaurants or cinemas and so on, we still will need to ensure that there's a safe distancing put in place. Even the table of 10, you probably won't be able to put in all 10 seats if you need to maintain certain distance between the seats. And therefore, we are not expecting all the venues to be full capacity, to operating at full capacity. So we think that moving from 5 to 8 is probably a reasonable increase. And we also do not want to have sudden increase with a large number, and as a result, then we end up with a big clusters of transmission. And therefore, we also have to take into account the potential risk that it will create by allowing a larger pool. And on balance, we feel that we have assessed that a group size of 8 is probably more manageable. And we will look at how, whether we can tweak it further as time goes on. Let's say, for example, if you are able to introduce pre-event testing and so on, we may be able to allow a larger number when the time comes. But for the time being, I think moving from 5 to 8 is a significant increase, and we need to continue to make sure the safe distancing measures are put in place at the venues so as to minimize the risk of super spreading events and to minimize the risk of big clusters being formed. So I think taking into account all these precautionary factors, we've decided that a group of 8 is probably what we can afford to increase to when the time comes.
Thank you, Minister. We have time for the last 2 questions. Can we have the next question from Philip from Bloomberg?
Yep. Thank you very much. I'm not sure to what extent anyone on this panel is involved, but I thought I would just ask this question anyway. Singapore, like the rest of Southeast Asia, is in the process of negotiating vaccine deals with manufacturing countries like China, US, and in some cases Russia. How worried are you about facing pressure to give ground on issues not related to vaccines as part of any deal to secure one, and what has been Singapore's experience? Thank you.
I think you have to repeat the question now, Philip.
The sound not so clear.
Okay, I'll try again. Singapore, like the rest of Southeast Asia, is in the process of negotiating vaccine deals with manufacturing countries, for example, China, US, and in other cases, Russia. How worried are you about facing pressure to give ground on issues not related to vaccines as part of any deal to secure one, and what has been Singapore's experience?
So far, we have not encountered major obstacles in negotiating with supplies of vaccines. It's all a matter of the state at which the development of vaccines is in. And we have, as DMS explained, we are in discussion with the multiple suppliers so that we are monitoring them very closely. And we also have to bear in mind that not all the vaccines may be successful eventually, and therefore we have to diversify our risk by engaging multiple suppliers in the negotiation. And in our negotiation, we also look at both price, quantity, as well as efficacy and safety. Different vaccines will have different characters, different nature, and some vaccines may be suitable for certain groups of people. They may have a counterindication for different groups of people. Whether they're suitable for us, for our use, also has to be decided on, and how to apply them. And as DMS mentioned, the priority in who should get it first is something that we are working on. The expert groups are discussing how to manage distribution, the vaccination of the population, and who should be given priority, whether it's a vulnerable group, whether it's the frontline workers, and also depends on the nature of the vaccine. And there's also a possibility of adverse effects from the vaccines. As you know, the vaccines have not been tested over a long period of time. Some of the adverse effects could only occur over a longer period of time. So we also have to bear in mind the potential risks of these vaccines. So it's a balancing between the benefits and the risks in determining what vaccines we should adopt and how we should apply it in the local context. So in negotiation with the manufacturers, we will continue to negotiate with them, and we are continuing to explore new manufacturers, new candidates that come on stream, and we keep our options open, and we will continue to secure additional supplies and diversify our sources.
Thank you, Minister. Our last question will be from Howie from Shinmin Daily News.
Hi, so my question is, I know it's still early now, but can we have a rough guide on how much will the antigen rapid test cost? It's like $20, $30, $50, $60, $80, $100, or what? A rough range.
We are actually still trying to finalize the costs, both with the manufacturers of these tests, because to some extent it depends also on the volume that we order and procure, but also because what ultimately is the operating cost for testing is not just the cost of the test kit, but it's also the operating costs associated with the whole process of delivering pre-event testing. So we are trying to work this out. We are quite confident that this would be much lower than what it would be for PCR testing, but where the final landing point is in terms of the actual costs incurred using these antigen rapid testing for pre-event settings hasn't been finalized yet. Certainly for the pilots that we are doing, we've committed to making sure that these are provided free, because we will be paying for this for the pilots themselves. But once we've completed that, we will be providing further updates whether or not testing in the pre-event setting will be charged once we scale this as a mainstream activity.
I think it's useful to recognize, I know in terms of cost figures, you will go online, you look at what some of these manufacturers are doing overseas, you will find a range of cost figures. We have to work out the manufacturer cost, as DMS said. In Singapore, depends on procurement, depends on the range of factors, but the test cost itself goes beyond the manufacturer cost. It's really the end-to-end, right? Because all of these tests so far, in terms of the antigen tests that we are looking at, still require a nose swab, right? You have to do a swab, you have to collect the sample, and then you have to get it tested. So all of that has to be factored in terms of how that cost will work out when it is applied in the different settings that we are considering. Of course, there may well be new test kits that may not even require a nose swab. For example, there is a company that's now looking at using breathalyzer, right? So it's you just using your breath, they do a test, and then they get the results in a very short time. That doesn't require a swab, but it requires different set of machines in order to run through. So the cost will be different. So we are exploring a range of different types of tests. There are some that are more readily available. It's already been done overseas, and we are bringing them into Singapore, and we will be able to roll them out quite soon. There are some that are still being piloted, and so the deployment time may take a bit longer. But I think this full range of different rapid test kits will complement the PCR test, and together with the scaled up contact tracing, TraceTogether we talk about, this enhanced testing regime, PCR plus rapid test kits, will allow us to enter phase 3 safely.